Millionaire woman mocks black manservant at Gala, not knowing he'd steal the spotlight when he grabbed the microphone. Her ridicule backfires when he captivates the audience with an unexpected talent. The gala takes a turn that leaves her and the guests reevaluating their judgments. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow across the marble floors of the Metropolitan Club, where New York's elite gathered for their annual winter gala. Clarissa Broughton made her entrance at 8 sharp, wearing a custom-made Valentino gown that sparkled with thousands of hand-sewn crystals. Her heels clicked against the polished floor as she navigated through the crowd, a glass of champagne held delicately between her manicured fingers. "Darling, you wouldn't believe the incompetence," Clarissa announced to a small group of socialites, her voice carrying across the room. "The valet nearly scratched my Bentley. I'll have to speak with management about their hiring standards." She took a calculated sip of her champagne, ensuring her red lipstick left a perfect mark on the glass. The group around her tittered appreciatively. Margaret Van Hudson, wearing last season's Chanel, nodded enthusiastically. "The help these days," she agreed. "It's impossible to find good staff." Across the room, servers in black uniforms weaved through the crowd with practiced efficiency. Among them, Elijah Carter maintained a neutral expression as he balanced a tray of hors d'oeuvres. At 28, he'd worked enough of these events to become invisible to the guests, which suited him fine tonight. His mind wandered to the sheet music hidden in his locker downstairs, songs he'd written during lunch breaks and late at night after his shift ended. A burst of laughter pulled him from his thoughts. A group of young socialites had gathered near the bar, pointing discreetly in his direction. "Look at that one," a blonde in a blue dress whispered, loud enough for him to hear. "He's been standing there daydreaming, probably wondering how to spell hors d'oeuvres." Elijah adjusted his bow tie and forced himself to move, circulating the room as he'd been trained. He'd learned early on that standing still made you a target. Keep moving, keep smiling, keep serving. It was the mantra of survival in this world. Clarissa's voice cut through the ambient chatter again. She'd moved to the center of the room, holding court with an even larger audience. "I simply told my interior designer that anything less than perfect was unacceptable. You should have seen his face." She paused, noticing Elijah approaching with his tray. "Oh, look who's finally decided to do his job." Elijah extended the tray toward her group, maintaining his professional smile. The crystals on Clarissa's dress caught the light, momentarily blinding him. He blinked, and his hand trembled slightly. "Careful there," Clarissa said, her voice dripping with false concern. "We wouldn't want an accident, would we? Those uniforms can't be cheap to dry clean on your salary." The group around her laughed on cue, the sound echoing off the high ceilings. Elijah felt heat rise in his cheeks, but kept his expression neutral. Years of practice had taught him how to wear this mask of servitude. He'd endured worse comments, but something about tonight felt different. Maybe it was the music he could hear drifting from the ballroom, or maybe it was the weight of his own dreams pressing against his chest. "Will there be anything else, ma'am?" he asked, his voice steady despite the humiliation burning in his throat. "Yes, actually," Clarissa said, examining him as if he were a curious specimen. "Do try to look a little less defeated. It's bringing down the mood of my party." More laughter followed, and Elijah retreated, his shoulder blades tight with tension. As he made his way back to the kitchen, he cooed. LD still hear Clarissa holding forth about the importance of maintaining standards. The sheet music in his locker seemed to call to him, a secret rebellion waiting to be voiced. But for now, he straightened his spine, adjusted his bow tie once more, and picked up a fresh tray of champagne. The night was young, and the real story was yet to unfold. The grand ballroom buzzed with subdued conversation as the first performer of the evening took the stage. A classically trained pianist, recommended by one of the board members, began playing Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. Despite the technical perfection of his performance, guests barely paused their conversations, treating the music as mere background noise. "Predictable choice," someone muttered near the bar. "It's the same program every year." Elijah moved through the crowd with a fresh tray of drinks, watching as a soprano in a burgundy gown replaced the pianist. Her voice, while professionally trained, failed to capture the audience's attention. Business deals were being struck in corners, gossip exchanged behind raised hands, and phones discreetly checked under tables. "God, I hope this ends soon," Clarissa announced loudly enough for the performer to hear. "I've heard better at community theater." She turned to her companion, not bothering to lower her voice. "Remind me to speak with the entertainment committee about next year's selections." The lighting technician dimmed the chandeliers, creating what should have been an intimate atmosphere. Instead, it merely provided better cover for guests to ignore the performances. A string quartet took the stage, launching into a competent but soulless rendition of Mozart. As Elijah approached a table with fresh glasses of champagne, the house speakers began playing a recorded track during the performer's intermission. The opening notes of Bridge Over Troubled Water filled the room, and something inside him shifted. This was the song his mother used to sing while cleaning houses, her voice carrying hope even on the hardest days. He nearly dropped his tray as memories flooded back. Weekend mornings in their small apartment, his mother teaching him harmonies while making pancakes. Late nights practicing in the building's stairwell because they couldn't afford a piano. The way she'd always said, "Your voice is a gift, baby. Don't let anyone tell you where and when to use it. Watch it." A guest snapped as Elijah's elbow brushed their chair. He apologized automatically, but his mind was already elsewhere. The sheet music in his locker wasn't just paper anymore. It was his mother's voice, her dreams, her belief in him. The song continued playing, and Elijah found himself mouthing the words. A younger server caught his eye and smiled encouragingly. She'd heard him singing in the kitchen during prep time, one of the few who knew his secret. The microphone stood unattended on the stage, bathed in a single spotlight. The next performer was running late, something about traffic. Elijah glanced at the event schedule he'd memorized. There was a 15-minute gap before the next act. His feet began moving before his brain could catch up. He set down his tray at the service station, adjusted his bow tie one last time, and took a step toward the stage. The weight of eyes turning to watch him felt like lead on his shoulders, but he kept walking. What does he think he's doing? Clarissa's voice cut through the murmur of conversation. Security should really be more attentive. But Elijah didn't stop. Each step carried the weight of years of silence, of dreams deferred, of his mother's faith in him. The microphone stood waiting, like a key to a door he'd never dared unlock. As he reached the stage steps, he heard the catering manager calling his name in a harsh whisper. Someone in the crowd laughed, that sharp, cruel sound he'd grown too familiar with. But for the first time in years, these sounds didn't matter. He reached for the microphone, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his fingertips. The spotlight warmed his face, and in that moment, he wasn't just a waiter at a high society gala. He was his mother's son, keeper of her dreams, and owner of a voice that had waited too long to be heard. The microphone feedback pierced the air for a brief moment as Elijah adjusted its height. In that suspended second, doubt crashed over him like a wave. But then he closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and began to sing. The first note of Feeling Good cut through the ambient chatter like a knife through silk. His voice, rich and unexpectedly powerful, commanded immediate attention. The conversation stuttered to a halt. Phones lowered. Glasses stopped clinking. The transformation was instant and electric. "I'm feeling good," he sang, each word carrying years of pent-up emotion. His voice filled every corner of the ballroom, raw and authentic in a way the previous performances hadn't been. The control in his vocals spoke of years of private practice, of talent carefully honed in secret. At her table near the front, Clarissa's champagne glass froze halfway to her lips. Her carefully curated expression of perpetual disdain cracked, replaced by something resembling genuine surprise. She set her glass down with an uncharacteristically unsteady hand. "Is that the waiter?" someone whispered, but the question was shushed immediately. Elijah opened his eyes now, confidence building with each phrase. He saw the shock on their faces, the way they leaned forward in their seats. The same people who had looked through him all evening were now unable to look away. His voice soared through the bridge of the song, Years of serving drinks and enduring casual cruelty transforming into pure musical energy. In the middle of the crowd, Sofia Martinez, a young gallery owner who'd been quietly sketching in her program, looked up with instant recognition of something kindred. Her pencil stilled on the paper as she watched him, seeing past the uniform to the artist beneath. As an up-and-coming figure in the art world, she knew the courage it took to claim space in rooms designed to exclude. The song built to its climax, and Elijah held nothing back. His voice carried not just melody but truth, about class, about assumptions, about the masks people wear. The final note hung in the air like a challenge, like a question none of them had known to ask. For 3 heartbeats after he finished, absolute silence filled the room. Then, as if a dam had broken, applause erupted. Not the polite, measured applause of society events, but genuine, spontaneous appreciation. People rose to their feet, their carefully maintained facades cracking with real emotion. Sofia was the first to stand, her artist's eye having caught the genuine moment of transformation. Others followed, a standing ovation building like a wave. Even the previous performers, waiting in the wings, applauded with professional appreciation. Clarissa remained seated, her world visibly tilting on its axis. Her carefully ordered reality, where waiters served drinks and knew their place, had just been shattered by 3 minutes of undeniable talent. Her hand shook slightly as she reached again for her champagne. The catering manager, who had been moving to stop the performance, now stood frozen by the service entrance, his reprimand dying unspoken. The other servers watched with a mixture of pride and vicarious vindication, their own dreams perhaps feeling a little more possible. Sofia made her way toward the stage, moving with the purposeful grace of someone used to navigating the art world. She carried herself differently from the other guests, less concerned with being seen and more focused on seeing. As she approached, her expression held recognition rather than surprise, as if she'd been waiting for something genuine to crack the evening's veneer. Elijah stepped back from the microphone, his heart racing. The spotlight still fey, LT warm on his face, but now it felt like belonging rather than exposure. He had crossed an invisible line, transformed from server to performer, from background to foreground. There would be no going back to invisible. As Sofia reached the stage steps, their eyes met. In that moment, both recognized something in the other, the courage to be authentic in a world of carefully constructed facades. The evening was about to take another unexpected turn. The applause finally settled, leaving a changed atmosphere in its wake. Elijah stood on stage, his bow tie slightly loosened, looking both exhilarated and uncertain about his next move. Before he could step away, Sofia reached the microphone. "That was extraordinary," she said, her voice carrying the slight trace of an Argentine accent. She wasn't dressed in the typical gala attire, instead wearing a vintage Yves Saint Laurent jumpsuit that spoke of artistic confidence rather than social conformity. "I'm Sofia Martinez, and I believe we're about to make this evening far more interesting." Elijah found himself drawn into conversation with her, forgetting momentarily about the hundreds of eyes still fixed on them. "Thank you," he managed, his performance confidence shifting into something more reserved. "Do you know the first time ever I saw your face?" Sofia asked, not bothering to whisper. Her question carried through the microphone, causing a ripple of murmurs through the crowd. When Elijah nodded, she turned to the house band. "Would you mind accompanying us?" The band leader, who had been watching with professional interest, nodded eagerly. As they began the gentle introduction, Elijah felt his heart rate spike again. A solo performance was one thing. He'd practiced alone countless times. But a duet, unrehearsed, with someone he'd just met? Sofia sensed his hesitation and stepped closer. "Trust the music," she whispered just for him. "We're already past the point of playing it safe." Their voices merged on the first line, and the chemistry was immediate. Sofia's mezzo-soprano complemented his baritone perfectly, their harmonies finding each other as if they'd rehearsed for weeks. The song, stripped of artifice and pretense, filled the room with raw emotion. In the crowd, phones remained down. No one was recording or posting. They were simply present, witnessing something authentic in a space usually reserved for performance of a different kind. The song spoke of first meetings, of unexpected connections, and the irony wasn't lost on anyone. Clarissa watched from her seat, her usual circle of sycophants forgotten. She recognized Sophia. The art world buzzed about her gallery's recent successes. But seeing her here, singing with a waiter, defying every social convention of these events, stirred something uncomfortable in Clarissa's carefully maintained worldview. As the duet built to its emotional peak, Elijah and Sophia turned slightly toward each other, their connection transcending the impromptu nature of their performance. Their voices wove together in the final verses, creating something neither could have achieved alone. The last note faded, and this time the silence lasted even longer. It was broken not by applause, but by a single voice from the back of the room. Encore. The call was taken up by others, and soon the whole room joined in. The band leader looked at them questioningly, ready to follow their lead. Sophia raised an eyebrow at Elijah, a silent question. "I know it's not traditionally done at these events," she said into the microphone. "But then again, nothing about this evening is turning out traditionally, is it?" Her smile carried a hint of mischief, a challenge to the stuffiness that usually characterized these galas. Elijah found himself smiling back, his earlier fears forgotten. He'd already crossed the line. Why not dance on the other side of it? He leaned into the microphone. "How about something less expected? Ain't no mountain high enough?" Crowd's response was immediate and enthusiastic. The band launched into the iconic introduction, and as Elijah and Sophia began to sing, the energy in the room transformed completely. Guests who had spent the evening in rigid social performance began to move to the music. Even some of the other servers, still carrying their trays, couldn't help swaying to the rhythm. The performance space was no longer a stage, but the center of a celebration. The artificial barriers between performer and audience, server and served, beginning to dissolve in the face of genuine joy. From her prime position near the stage, Clarissa Broughton watched the scene unfold with growing discomfort. The carefully orchestrated social hierarchy she'd spent years maintaining was crumbling before her eyes. Guests who normally hung on her every word were now focused entirely on the unlikely duo on stage. And worse, they were enjoying themselves without her approval. "Clarissa, darling," Victoria Ashworth, her closest friend of 20 years, touched her arm. "Perhaps we've been wrong about certain things." Victoria's voice carried an unusual note of uncertainty. As the chairwoman of 3 major charity boards, she rarely questioned their shared social outlook. "Wrong." Clarissa's response came automatically, but lacked its usual sharp edge. She watched as Margaret Van Hudson, who earlier had joined in mocking the staff, now danced freely to the music, her designer shoes discarded under her chair. The transformation of the room was undeniable. The invisible walls between social classes had become remarkably visible in their collapse. Even the other servers had stopped their mechanical circling of the room, standing in small groups, openly enjoying the performance of their colleague. "Look at them," Victoria continued, gesturing to Sophia and Elijah. "There's something rather magnificent about authentic talent, isn't there? Without the usual packaging." She smoothed her door dress self-consciously, as if suddenly aware of its role as armor rather than clothing. Clarissa felt a memory surface, unwanted but insistent. 25 years ago, she'd been the scholarship student at Wellington Prep, wearing secondhand uniforms and practicing her diction to hide her outer borough accent. She'd spent years building her current persona, crafting herself into someone who belonged in these rooms. Now, watching Elijah own his talent without apology, she felt the weight of every compromise she'd made. "I once wanted to be a photographer," she found herself saying aloud. Victoria turned to her, surprised. "Before I married Charles, I used to carry my camera everywhere." The confession felt dangerous, like a crack in a dam. Around them, the atmosphere continued to shift. A renowned surgeon was sharing his hidden passion for jazz piano with a corporate lawyer who admitted to taking secret singing lessons. An investment banker revealed his weekend hobby of street photography to an intrigued group of listeners. The performance had somehow given permission for truth-telling. People were sharing their own buried dreams, their abandoned passions. The carefully maintained facades of success and satisfaction were showing hairline fractures. "Remember when we used to talk about changing the world?" Victoria asked quietly. "Before we decided it was more important to rule it?" Her laugh carried a hint of regret. Clarissa watched as Sophia pulled a reluctant young server onto the stage, encouraging her to share her voice. The girl's initial terror transformed into joy as she discovered her own talent, supported by Elijah's gentle guidance and Sophia's enthusiastic encouragement. "We've become what we used to despise, haven't we?" Clarissa's words came out barely above a whisper, but Victoria heard them. Both women sat in uncomfortable silence, watching their carefully curated world reshape itself around them. A junior associate from Victoria's law firm approached their table, emboldened by the evening's shift in protocol. "Mrs. Ashworth, Mrs. Broughton," she began tentatively, "we're forming an impromptu chorus. Would you like to join us?" 5 hours ago, such an invitation would have been social suicide for the young lawyer. Now, Victoria stood up immediately, surprising herself as much as others. She turned to Clarissa, extending her hand. "Coming, darling? Perhaps it's time we remembered who we were before we became who we are." Clarissa sat frozen, feeling the weight of decades of carefully constructed identity pressing down on her. On stage, Elijah caught her eye. There was no judgment in his look, no triumph or revenge for her earlier cruelty. Instead, she saw only invitation, the same open acceptance he was showing to everyone else. The choice hung in the air: remain in her seat, clutching the remnants of her artificial authority, or stand and step into this new, more authentic space that was forming around her. After several minutes of internal struggle, Clarissa rose from her chair, smoothing her dress with hands that trembled slightly. The path to the stage felt longer than ever, each step carrying the weight of her earlier behavior. Around her, the gala had transformed into something unrecognizable, a celebration of authenticity that defied every rule of her social handbook. As she approached Elijah during a brief break between songs, she noticed details she'd previously ignored. The careful mending on his shirt cuff, the slight calluses on his fingers visible as he adjusted the microphone, the quiet dignity in his posture that had nothing to do with servitude. "Mr. Carter," she began, her usually commanding voice uncertain. The use of his name, which she'd bothered to learn only after his performance, felt like a small but significant concession. "Might I have a moment?" Elijah turned, surprise flickering across his features. Sophia, standing nearby, watched the interaction with careful attention, ready to intervene if necessary. The nearby conversations quieted as people noticed this unexpected confrontation. "Of course, Mrs. Broughton," Elijah replied, his tone professional but guarded. The memory of her earlier mockery hung between them like an invisible wall. Clarissa clasped her hands together, her diamond bracelet catching the light. "I believe I owe you an apology," she said, the words feeling foreign on her tone. "My behavior earlier this evening was—" She paused, searching for a word that wouldn't minimize her actions. "Cruel." The nearby conversations stopped entirely. Clarissa Broughton, queen of the Upper East Side social scene, had never been heard apologizing to anyone, let alone service staff. Even Victoria looked stunned. "Your talent is extraordinary," Clarissa continued, pushing through the discomfort. "But more than that, your courage in sharing it. It's made me question things I've accepted without thought for far too long." Elijah studied her face, looking for signs of insincerity. "Thank you, Mrs. Broughton," he replied carefully. "Though I have to wonder if I would be receiving this apology if I hadn't sung tonight." His quiet challenge hung in the air. Clarissa felt the heat of nearby gazes. The weight of judgment she'd so often placed on others now turned toward her. "No," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Probably not. And that's exactly what I need to change." Sophia stepped closer, her presence adding another layer to the dynamic. "Change isn't easy," she offered, her tone neutral but encouraging, "especially when we've spent years building walls we thought we needed." "I don't expect you to trust my sincerity," Clarissa continued, addressing Elijah directly. "I haven't earned that. But perhaps this could be a beginning." Elijah's expression remained cautious. Years of experience had taught him that people in Clarissa's position rarely changed fundamentally. A beginning of what exactly, he asked. I'm not entirely. Why, sure, Clarissa admitted, the honesty feeling strangely liberating. But I know I don't want to be the person I was at the start of this evening. A slight smile touched Elijah's lips, not quite reaching his eyes. That's a start, Mrs. Broughton, but you'll understand if I need time to believe in this transformation. The exchange was interrupted by the band starting up again. Sophia touched Elijah's arm gently, signaling another song was about to begin. Clarissa stepped back, understanding the moment had reached its natural conclusion. As she returned to her seat, she felt lighter, despite Elijah's reserved response. For the first time in years, she'd spoken without calculation, without considering the social implications. It was terrifying and oddly exhilarating. Victoria leaned over as she sat down. Well, that was certainly unexpected, she remarked. Are you all right? Clarissa watched as Elijah and Sophia began another duet, their voices blending in perfect harmony. No, she replied honestly, but maybe that's not a bad thing. The evening had shifted into something resembling an impromptu talent show, with the rigid social structure giving way to a more organic gathering. Small groups formed and reformed across the ballroom, no longer divided by tax brackets or social standing, but by shared interests and hidden passions. Near the stage, a circle of guests sat cross-legged on the expensive carpet. Designer dresses and tuxedos be damned, sharing stories of abandoned dreams and renewed possibilities. Among them, a hedge fund manager admitted to writing poetry in secret, pulling up a worn notebook from his inside pocket. Sophia, taking a break from performing, moved through the crowd with natural ease. Her presence seemed to encourage confession and connection. My gallery isn't just about showing established artists, she explained to an attentive group. It's about creating space for unexpected voices. Actually, I'm planning an exhibition next month called Hidden Talents. The timing of her announcement caught everyone's attention. Several guests turned toward her, intrigued by the synchronicity. What kind of exhibition? Asked a woman who had earlier performed an impressive impromptu ballet routine. She was still wearing her heels, but her perfect chignon had come undone during her dance. Sophia's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. It's meant to challenge our assumptions about who gets to be an artist. We're featuring works by people whose day jobs might not suggest their artistic abilities. A taxi driver who creates stunning watercolors. A janitor who sculpts with found objects. You should feature Elijah, someone suggested, and murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Clarissa, who had been listening quietly, saw an opportunity. She stood, smoothing her dress with practiced grace. I have some experience with event promotion, she offered, her voice carrying a new note of humility. If you'd be interested in collaboration, Sophia studied her for a moment, weighing the sincerity of the offer. Actually, I would, she decided. But on one condition, you have to contribute something personal to the exhibition. Something that shows who you are beneath the social persona. The challenge hung in the air. Several people held their breath, waiting for Clarissa's response. I still have my old photographs, Clarissa said quietly. From before I decided they weren't sophisticated enough for my new life. Victoria gasped softly beside her. She'd been there when Clarissa had packed away her cameras, choosing instead to become the perfect society wife. The gala continued to evolve as midnight approached. Business cards were exchanged not for networking, but for genuine connection. A spontaneous writers group formed in one corner, while another group planned weekly music sessions. Ladies and gentlemen, the event coordinator announced nervously, we're technically scheduled to end in 15 minutes. But no on. He moved to leave. Instead, Elijah returned to the microphone. Perhaps we could move this somewhere else? Keep the spirit of tonight alive. My gallery, Sophia offered immediately. It's just a few blocks away. We could continue there, more informal, more real. The suggestion was met with enthusiastic agreement. Even the servers, their shifts officially ending, were invited to join. The carefully planned seating arrangements and social hierarchies of the gala had been permanently disrupted. As people began gathering their belongings, a sense of anticipation filled the air. This wasn't just the end of a party. It was the beginning of something new. Business moguls helped stack chairs. Socialites gathered discarded glasses, and the lines between server and served blurred beyond recognition. The catering manager, who had started the evening enforcing rigid protocols, now stood bewildered as his staff freely mingled with guests. He finally shrugged and loosened his tie, joining a discussion about jazz with a Supreme Court judge and a busboy who played saxophone. In the midst of it all, Clarissa found herself helping to pack up sheet music with the band, her designer dress forgotten as she debated chord progressions with the pianist. For the first time in decades, she felt real, messy, and uncertain, but authentically alive. As the guests prepared for their impromptu relocation to Sophia's gallery, a tall man in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit made his way through the crowd. Marcus Sterling, one of the most influential music producers in the industry, hadn't planned to attend tonight's gala. He'd only stopped by to meet a client, but had been drawn in by Elijah's voice carrying through the entrance hall. "Excuse me," he said, approaching Elijah with the quiet confidence of someone used to shaping careers. "I'm Marcus Sterling from Catalyst Records." He extended a business card that carried just his name and the company logo, the kind of minimalist design that spoke of real power. The surrounding conversations hushed. Several people who had been heading for the door paused, sensing another shift in the evening's trajectory. Elijah took the card with slightly trembling hands, recognition dawning on his face. Everyone in the music industry knew Sterling's reputation for discovering unique talents. "Your performance tonight," Sterling continued, his voice carrying the practiced neutrality of a man who'd learned to mask his excitement. "It's exactly what we've been looking for. Raw, authentic, unexpected. Would you be interested in recording a demo at our studio?" The offer hung in the air like a suspended note. Sophia, standing nearby, watched Elijah's expression shift from shock to cautious hope. Around them, the crowd began to press closer, the energy in the room crackling with renewed intensity. Yes, of course," Elijah managed, his professional waiter's composure momentarily cracking. "Thank you, Mr. Sterling." Sterling smiled, the expression barely touching his eyes. "Call me Marcus. And don't thank me. This is purely business. Talent like yours is rare, especially in these." He gestured around the room, manufactured spaces. The crowd's reaction was immediate. Those who had ignored Elijah for years now pressed forward, offering congratulations, claiming long-standing support of his talent. Business cards appeared from designer clutches and bespoke suit pockets, each person eager to establish connection with what they now saw as an emerging star. From her position near the stage, Clarissa observed the transformation with complex emotions playing across her face. The same people who had laughed at her cruelty earlier were now performing their own kind of hypocrisy. More importantly, she realized she was no longer the center of attention in a room she'd always dominated. "Fascinating, isn't it?" Victoria murmured beside her. How quickly the tides turn. Clarissa watched as an investment banker who'd barely tipped Elijah all evening now offered to have his entertainment lawyer review any contracts. The speed of the social realignment was dizzying. Sterling, meanwhile, had drawn Elijah and Sophia slightly apart from the crowd. "We should discuss details," he said, pulling out his phone. "My team can have contracts ready by morning. We'll want to move quickly, capitalize on the organic buzz from tonight." "Actually," Elijah said, his voice finding new strength, "I'd like to take some time to consider my options." The confidence from his performance hadn't fully faded. "And I'd appreciate any contracts being reviewed by independent counsel." Sterling's eyebrows rose slightly, impressed. "Of course. Smart man. Here's my direct number. Call me when you're ready." He handed Elijah another card, this one with a handwritten number on the back. As Sterling moved away, the crowd began to shift again, some following him, others clustering around Elijah with renewed interest. The power dynamics in the room continued their fluid dance of realignment. Sophia touched Elijah's arm gently. "You okay?" she asked quietly. "I think so," he replied, pocketing both cards. "It's just a lot. Welcome to the other side of the velvet rope," she said with a knowing smile. "Just remember, you're the same person you were 3 hours ago. They're the ones who've changed." Clarissa, watching this exchange, felt something unfamiliar stir in her chest. Was it envy? Not of Elijah's sudden success, but of something else, something more fundamental. The authenticity he maintained even as the world shifted around him. "Clarissa, dear, do you have a moment?" Richard Whitmore, her father's longtime financial advisor, caught her elbow as the crowd continued to buzz around Elijah. His expression carried an urgency that seemed out of place amid the evening's celebrations. Leading her to a quiet corner, Richard lowered his voice. "I've been meaning to tell you something for weeks, but given tonight's events, it seems particularly relevant." He pulled out a leather portfolio from his briefcase. "Your grandmother's trust is finally cleared for distribution." Clarissa's perfectly maintained facade cracked slightly. "I thought that trust was depleted years ago. Father always said." "Your father," Richard interrupted gently, "wasn't always truthful about financial matters. Your grandmother set aside a significant portion of her estate in a separate trust specifically for you. She stipulated it should only be revealed when you showed signs of." He consulted the document. "Returning to your authentic self." The words hit Clarissa like a physical force. She reached for a nearby chair, her legs suddenly unsteady. "How much?" she whispered. "Enough to live comfortably without any need for social positioning," Richard replied. "Your grandmother was quite specific about wanting you to have the freedom to pursue your own path, just as she did after your grandfather passed." Memories flooded back. Her grandmother's quiet rebellion against society's expectations, her support of local artists, her insistence that true wealth lay in authenticity rather than appearance. Clarissa had dismissed these ideas as romantic nonsense when she'd chosen her path up the social ladder. "Does Charles know?" she asked, referring to her husband. "No. The trust is entirely separate from your marital assets. You have complete control over its disposition." The revelation settled around her like a weight and a liberation simultaneously. Across the room, she watched as Elijah maintained his dignity amid the swirling attention, while Sophia stood protectively nearby. They embodied everything she'd sacrificed for social position: authenticity, artistic passion, genuine connection. Victoria approached, noting her friend's distress. "Darling, what's wrong?" Clarissa looked at her oldest friend, seeing for the first time how they'd encouraged each other's worst instincts over the years. "I have a choice to make," she said slowly. "Actually, for the first time in decades, I have real choices." "About what?" "About everything." Clarissa stood, smoothing her dress in a habitual gesture that now felt somehow false. "My grandmother left me enough money to be independent. I don't need to maintain this performance anymore." Victoria's eyes widened. "What will you do?" "That's the question, isn't it?" Clarissa watched as another group of socialites converged on Elijah, their sudden interest transparently opportunistic. "I can help make actual change. Support real talent, not just social climbers. Use the money to create opportunities rather than barriers. The board positions, the charity committees, the social season." Victoria's voice trailed off. "All carefully constructed to maintain power," Clarissa finished. "But what if we use that influence differently? What if we actually help people instead of just appearing to?" The weight of decades of calculated decisions pressed against her consciousness. Every snub, every orchestrated social maneuver, every person she'd stepped on while climbing the social ladder, they all seemed hollow now. Yet the thought of changing terrified her. She'd played her role for so long, worn her mask so consistently, that she wasn't sure she remembered how to be real anymore. The social world she'd helped create might be artificial, but it was familiar, safe. "Your grandmother would be proud," Richard said quietly, gathering his documents. "She always said you had her spirit beneath everything else." Clarissa stood at the crossroads of her carefully constructed life, watching as the gala's unexpected evolution continued around her. The choice loomed: remain in her familiar role or risk everything for authenticity. The evening was nearing its transformation point, the moment when the gala would either disperse into memory or evolve into something new at Sophia's gallery. As Elijah prepared for what he thought would be his final song of the night, Marcus Sterling received a text that made him pause thoughtfully. "Before we conclude," Sterling announced, his voice cutting through the ambient chatter, there's something else you should know about tonight's surprising talent. He glanced at Elijah, who was adjusting the microphone. Your father sends his regards, Elijah. The room fell silent. Elijah's hands froze on the microphone stand. My father, James Carter, Sterling said, watching Elijah's reaction carefully. Though you might know him better by his stage name, Jay Solomon. The revelation rippled through the crowd. Jay Solomon, the legendary soul singer who disappeared from the music scene 15 years ago at the height of his career. His disappearance had spawned countless theories and documentaries. That's impossible, Elijah whispered, but even as he spoke, memories surfaced. His mother's evasiveness about his father, her insistence on teaching him music, the familiar melodies that had always seemed to live in his blood. Sterling nodded to someone at the back of the room. A man stepped forward from the shadows, older, distinguished, with the same quiet intensity that Elijah had displayed earlier. Jay Solomon had aged well, his signature dreadlocks now streaked with gray, his face lined but dignified. I've been looking for you for years, Jay said, his voice carrying the same rich timbre that had once filled stadiums. After your mother passed, the trail went cold. Until tonight, when an old friend sent me a video of your performance. Elijah gripped the microphone stand for support. Why did you leave? The industry was destroying me, Jay replied simply. The pressure, the artificial personality they wanted me to maintain. I chose freedom over fame. But leaving you, his voice cracked slightly. That was never part of the plan. Sophia moved closer to Elijah, providing silent support. The crowd watched, transfixed, as 15 years of music industry mystery unraveled before them. I was your agent back then, Sterling added. Watched your father choose authenticity over commercial success. When I heard you sing tonight, I knew. The voice, the spirit, it's in your blood. Clarissa, standing at the edge of the crowd, felt the weight of her own recent revelations amplify. Here was another story about choosing between authenticity and appearance, truth and facade. Would you? Jay hesitated, then continued. Would you sing with me? Just once. The request hung in the air. Elijah looked at Sophia, who nodded encouragingly, then at the crowd that had transformed from audience to witnesses of something profound. Father and son approached the microphone together. The band, sensing the moment, began playing the opening notes of A Change Is Gonna Come, Jay Solomon's signature song. Their voices merged in perfect harmony, genetics and artistry combining in a way that left no doubt about their connection. The song, about hope and transformation, seemed to speak to everyone in the room about their own journeys toward authenticity. Clarissa, watching father and son heal 15 years of separation through music, made her decision. She found Sophia in the crowd and whispered something in her ear. Sophia's eyes widened, then she smiled and nodded. As the song concluded, Sophia stepped forward. The gallery opening next month, she announced, will now be co-sponsored by the newly established Broughton Foundation for Artistic Freedom. She glanced at Clarissa. Sometimes the most unexpected voices come from the most unexpected places. The evening had become more than a gala, more than a performance, more than a reunion. It had become a moment of collective transformation, where masks fell away and authentic selves emerged. As the crowd finally prepared to move to Sophia's gallery, Elijah, his father, and Sterling discussing possibilities for the future, Clarissa caught her reflection in a window. For the first time in years, she recognized herself and smiled. The story ends here, bringing together all the threads of transformation, authenticity, and unexpected connections that began with a single brave performance.